Hey, everybody out there in YouTube land. Emil Grederson back here for Sweet Jesus, because ice cream is sweet, but Jesus is sweeter. It has been a long time. I had a lot of things just come up, all kinds of unexpected things kind of get in the way, but I wanted to finish up getting through this great book, The Reason for God. We are only about halfway through. And so I thought tonight I would give it a shot. You may notice I look a little different. I don't know how long this is going to stay, but when you have a couple of cute little girls that want you to have a beard for their birthday, you grow a beard, even if you don't think it looks all that great. So here it is. You're stuck with it. I'm stuck with it. Their birthdays are around the corner, so don't worry, it won't be too long. But sweet Jesus. Tonight, I'm going with my old favorite. It is Chocolate Mousse Tracks, Giant Eagle's kind of generic brand, store brand. But I decided to spice it up a little bit tonight. Maybe you saw in the thumbnail. Got Smucker's Sundae syrup, some caramel, and chocolate syrup sprayed on the top of this with the Chocolate Mousse Tracks. I'm almost done because I'm going to start doing a lot of talking. But I hope you have got your own favorite dessert. Ice cream, brownies, pie, cookies, whatever. Ice cream is by far my favorite. And make sure you take a nice big bite to get ready for Sweet Jesus. All right. So this episode will take us through chapter 7, titled "You Can't Take the Bible Literally." And I know there are an awful lot of you out there that are just kind of tuning in and you still haven't got the book. Get the book. It's really good. It's really helpful. It'll fill in so much more than I can fill in just through these videos. And actually, I'm kind of thinking I'd like to speed through these a little bit more. But definitely get the book, and you can come back and follow along a little bit more closely with me. And there's so much good stuff in here. It will be tremendously helpful and beneficial for you. But here we go. You can't take the Bible literally. That's chapter 7. And there's a couple of quotes here at the beginning. I kind of like reading those just to set the stage for us. The first one, it says, "I see much of the Bible's teaching as historically inaccurate," said Charles, an investment banker. "We can't be sure the Bible's account of events is what really happened." And then this is the second quote. "I'm sure you're right, Charles," answered Jacqueline, a woman working in finance. "But my biggest problem with the Bible is that it is culturally obsolete. Much of the Bible's social teaching, for example, about women, is socially regressive. So it is impossible to accept the Bible as the complete authority Christians think it is." So if you're a Christian, I am sure that you've heard something along those lines at some point. If you're not a Christian, this is probably one of the big reasons why not. A lot of criticism about the Bible, and Christians think the Bible is pretty important. So it seems like a non-starter right there. So that's what we're going to tackle tonight. That's what Tim Keller tackles in this chapter. And he starts out talking about how when he was in college, he encountered this kind of thinking from a lot of his professors. His professors taught that the New Testament Gospels originated as the oral traditions of various church communities around the Mediterranean, and these were addressing particular needs in each church. Leaders made certain that the Jesus in these stories supported the policies and beliefs of their communities. The oral traditions were then passed down over the years, evolving over time through the addition of various legendary materials. And finally, long after the actual events, the Gospels assumed written form. And by then, it was almost impossible to know to what degree, if any, they represented the actual, actual historical events. I'm sure you're familiar with this. This is a very common idea. So then, who is the historical Jesus? Who's the real Jesus? Some interesting stuff in there. There's this idea. We'll talk about the Da Vinci Code. It comes up in the chapter about it's a novel and became a movie. Tom Hanks is in it. Hey, there's all these people that are trying to get their own ideas of who Jesus was out there, and they win the war, they win the battle, and so they get to decide what's in the Bible. And basically, all of that is nonsense. And there is little to no actual historical, academic information that really supports that idea at all. And that's kind of where he's going here. If what the critics think is true, obviously that would change everything pretty significantly. But what Tim Keller notes is, as a student, he was initially shaken by all of this, as anyone would be, and as I was even at various points in college, not knowing all the answers to some of these tough things. But how could all of these prominent scholars be wrong? Then, however, as I did my own first-hand research, I was surprised at how little evidence there actually was for these historical reconstructions. To my encouragement, the evidence for this older, skeptical view of the Bible has been crumbling steadily for the past 30 years, even as it has been promoted by the popular media through books and movies such as the Da Vinci Code. So it's gaining in popularity because it's more out there in the culture. This idea is circulating more in the culture and in the media, the popular media. But the reality is that if you do research, you find kind of feels like they're making this up. And that's actually what he goes into right away here. Anne Rice was one person startled to discover how weak the case for a merely human historical Jesus really is. Rice is a famous author of Interview with the Vampire. She was raised Catholic, lost her faith at a secular college, married an atheist, became wealthy writing novels, and it shocked the literary and media world when Rice announced that she had returned to Christianity. And why did she do it? She explains that she had begun doing extensive research about the historical Jesus by reading the work of Jesus scholars at the most respected academic institutions. And their main thesis was that the biblical documents we have aren't historically reliable. And she was amazed at how weak their argument was. And here's a quote from Anne Rice. Some books were no more than assumptions piled on assumptions. Conclusions were reached on the basis of little or no data at all. The whole case for the non-divine Jesus who stumbled into Jerusalem and somehow accidentally got crucified is kind of the way it is portrayed sometimes. That whole picture, which had floated around the liberal circles I frequented as an atheist for 30 years, that case was not made. Not only was it not made, I discovered in this field some of the worst and most biased scholarship I'd ever read. It's pretty serious, and I have to say I've kind of experienced it myself, watching some of these scholars go out into major news networks doing interviews and things like that. The Daily Show, even Comedy Central's Daily Show. I think there's a remark, a comment, passing comment at some point near the end of this chapter about that, how these people are now all over the place, right? And it seems like this unending battle. So the Christian faith requires belief in the Bible, and a lot of people just think it can't be taken seriously, it can't be taken literally. Maybe many or most parts are scientifically impossible, historically unreliable, and culturally regressive. We looked at the first of these issues of science and the Bible in the last episode, last chapter. Now we will look at the other two. And so here we go. We can't trust the Bible historically. One of the criticisms is that this has just taken so much time, and over time things change and people embellish and all that kind of stuff. But the interesting thing is when you actually look at this and you look at what most honest scholars, overwhelming number of scholars, agree that people like Paul wrote things 15 to 25 years after the death of Jesus. That means there are an awful lot of people still alive at the time that people are reading, receiving and reading and sharing and distributing the letters of the Apostle Paul. So it's 15 to 25 years after the death of Jesus. There are probably an awful lot of people that are still alive, aren't there? There are an awful lot of people that were eyewitnesses. There are an awful lot of people that are not only supporters, Christians themselves, that are willing to support those stories, those tales, but even the enemies are around, and there's very little pushback by any of the people that are opposed to or even just indifferent to the whole Christian movement. That's kind of what we get going at here. Keller here decides to basically just take a look at the four Gospels. There's a lot more you could talk about with the rest of the Bible, but the four Gospels are central to the Christian faith, and certainly we, as Christians, think that the whole Bible is very important and normative and formative for us and our faith and our following of Jesus. But he decides, with the limited amount of space he's got, to tackle the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they are not much later than Paul, at most 40 to 60 years after the events. And again, plenty of people that are still alive at that point to either affirm or refute all of these things. There is some evidence here. There's a guy named Richard Bauckham. I think when you look through the notes in the back of the book here, there's a lot of citations from this theologian, a lot of different books of his, and he's got something here, a landmark book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It says, Richard Bauckham marshals much historical evidence to demonstrate that at the time the Gospels were written, there were still numerous well-known living eyewitnesses to Jesus's teaching and life events. They had committed them to memory, and they remained active in the public life of the churches throughout their lifetimes, serving as ongoing sources and guarantors of the truth of those accounts. Bauckham uses evidence within the Gospels themselves to show that the Gospel writers actually named their eyewitness sources within the text to assure readers of their account's authenticity. This is actually pretty neat. There's a passage in Mark 15:21, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verse 21. There's a man who helped Jesus carry his cross to Calvary, and it says there that it was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, there is no reason for the author to include such names unless the readers know or could have access to them. Mark is saying, Alexander and Rufus vouch for the truth of what I am telling you if you want to ask them. Pretty powerful. And you could say that that's just a detail to make it more believable or interesting or something like that, but we're actually going to get to that point a little bit later on in this chapter. That's just not how people wrote. If it was a novel, if it was made up, there wasn't even an idea for several hundred years. Anyway, we'll get to that a little bit later. So Paul then refers to a body of 500 eyewitnesses who saw the risen Christ at once. You can't write that in a document designed for public reading unless there really were surviving witnesses whose testimony agreed and who could confirm what the author said. All this decisively refutes the idea that the Gospels were anonymous, collective, evolving oral traditions. Instead, they were oral histories taken down from the mouths of the living eyewitnesses who preserve the words and deeds of Jesus in great detail. So there you go, 500 people at once, and Paul's writing 15 to 25 years after the events of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and these are being circulated pretty widely. You don't circulate things widely and say things like that if there aren't people to back it up. Okay, and then again, in this section here, we get back now to this idea of people who aren't even supporters. Many bystanders, officials, and opponents who had actually heard Jesus teach, seen his actions, and watched him die. They would have been especially ready to challenge any accounts that were fabricated. For a highly altered, fictionalized account of an event to take hold in the public imagination, it is necessary that the eyewitnesses and their children and grandchildren all be long dead. They must be off the scene so they cannot contradict or debunk the embellishments and falsehoods of the story. The Gospels were written far too soon for this to occur. Just again, the dating of these documents goes back much farther than most people have talked about publicly and in more popular media circles. Paul himself says this in various points. There's a quote here from Acts 26:26. These things were not done in a corner, Paul says to King Agrippa. If there had been appearances after his death, if there had not been an empty tomb, if he had not made these claims and these public documents claim they happened, Christianity would never have gotten off the ground. The hearers would have simply laughed at the accounts. Right? And so all this stuff happened right out in the open, and nobody refutes it. They're baffled by it. They think it's kind of weird, kind of crazy. Hey, these guys are worshiping this man Jesus as if a god. There are these people that keep talking about this guy Jesus, who we know was crucified, and they keep saying he was alive. Right? Those are the kinds of things we find in outside sources outside the Bible. Now, some of the other Gospels, so-called Gospels, so typically this is a revelation of some kind around Christmas time or Holy Week and Easter. Some scholar somewhere decides that this is the perfect time to release their latest research, their latest find, and it's the Gospel of Judas. It's the Gospel of Jesus's wife. It's the Gospel of, all these different things to try and kind of squash the celebration that Christians around the world are trying to engage in. But so here's something about the Gnostic Gospels in general, which is a group of these non-canonical Gospels. It says the Gospel of Thomas, the best known of the Gnostic documents, is a translation from the Syriac, and scholars have shown that the Syriac traditions in Thomas can be dated to 175 AD at the earliest, more than 100 years after the time that the canonical Gospels were in widespread use. So this is some of the stuff that comes out. It's just the people that make these claims about what's wrong with the Bible actually use documents that are actually the problem, that actually have the issues and problems that they're saying the canonical Gospels have. It's like projection, if you're familiar with psychology at all. Like they can't stand the fact that they're insane with the way that they talk about these documents, so they blame us Christians for it. It really baffles the mind. And then he quotes Adam Gopnik from the New Yorker magazine. He wrote that the Gnostic Gospels were so late that they no more challenged the basis of the church's faith than the discovery of a document from the 19th century written in Ohio and defending King George would be a challenge to the basis of American democracy. All right, so here's the idea here. The idea is these new things that come out, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Jesus, of Mary, Jesus' wife, whatever, all these things, they are so late. How could they possibly used to refute the arguments of the canonical Gospels? They can't. That's his example. It's like finding something in Ohio from the 19th century talking about King George and American democracy. It's when you see those things, and they always seem to come out, like I said, around Christmas and Easter every year. Apparently, the way it feels for a lot of Christians is they're just trying to pour water on, put a wet blanket on, the most celebratory times of the year for us as Christians. And so when you see that stuff, none of it is early enough to matter at all. Those are the made up stories. Those are the novels. Those are the things that are just bizarre. Zero credibility as far as dictating to us what the Christian faith is, what it can be, what it should be. Just not helpful at all. Okay, so the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, recognized as authoritative eyewitness accounts almost immediately. We have Irenaeus of Lyon in 160 AD declaring that there were four and only four Gospels. This idea from the Da Vinci Code that Constantine determined the New Testament canon and casted aside the earlier and supposedly more authentic Gnostic Gospels. It's just simply not true. As for the Da Vinci Code, people know it's all fictitious, that it's a novel, but many people find plausible this idea, the premise that depicts Constantine in 325 as basically decreeing Jesus's divinity and suppressing all the evidence that he was human. But of course, that's silly. And he makes that case right here. Philippians, Paul's letter to the Philippians, a very early Christian document, talks about Christians worshiping Jesus as God. This is Philippians chapter 2. There's a hymn that Paul is using. It seems to be fairly well known, and it talks about Jesus being God in the flesh. And so if you're talking about the early to mid first century people circulating, a follower of Jesus, an apostle, Paul, circulating something that is widely known as a hymn celebrating the divinity of Jesus, how in the world could we give any credence to this ridiculous notion that Constantine decided that Jesus was God in 325 AD? It's absurd, completely absurd. Belief in the deity of Christ was part of the dynamic from the beginning in the growth of the early Christian church. One historian, there's a quote here, it's fascinating. This is page 107. Dan Brown says that the Emperor Constantine imposed a whole new interpretation on Christianity at the Council of Nicaea in 325. That is, he decreed the belief in Jesus' divinity and suppressed all evidence of his humanity. This would mean Christianity won the religious competition in the Roman Empire by an exercise of power rather than by any attraction it exerted. But in actual historical fact, the church had won that competition long before that time, before it had any power, when it was still under sporadic persecution. If a historian were cynical, you would say Constantine chose Christianity because it had already won, and he wanted to back a winner. That is far more likely the case than anything that comes even close to what Dan Brown suggests in his novel, and which is circulated widely. All right, so the next section here, the content is far too counterproductive for the Gospels to be legends. Well, this is great. This is a section where basically the things that are in the Bible are just so out there as far as almost seeming to work against what you would assume would be what people would put out there if they wanted to try and propagate their ideas. They do everything wrong. uh, so, for example, Jesus rarely takes sides. There are all kinds of people asking him all kinds of questions. If these were written much later after the fact, you would think that someone would put Jesus in one of these discussions about a particular hot button issue at the time, and that Jesus on his lips would be the answer that they wanted. But it turns out that that just doesn't happen. Jesus seems to not answer. And he doesn't talk about a lot of the things that trouble the church very early on. For one of the examples Keller references here is this idea about circumcision. There are an awful lot of Gentiles coming into the Christian church. These are people that are not Jewish and had not practiced circumcision, and it becomes an issue where Christians that came from Jewish backgrounds and Christians that came from non-Jewish backgrounds, they're having debates, serious confrontations and conflict over whether or not these new Gentile Christians need to be circumcised in order to be part of the church. Really big issue. And yet Jesus says nothing about it. Not the kind of documents that would have been written by people trying to win some sort of battle, theological battle. And why make up the crucifixion? Who in the world would have their number one leader completely humiliated on a cross to die as just a huge embarrassing failure? People would assume that he was a criminal because that didn't just happen, right? I mean, people didn't just get randomly crucified. You must have done something wrong, but it's part of the story. And it's an offensive part of the story, as the Bible itself says, a stumbling block for a lot of people. And then why make up Jesus asking God to get out of the mission? Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. Why would you portray your leader as this weak man in a culture that did not look very kindly on weakness like that? Or what about the cry of dereliction? My God, why have you forsaken me? And this is this is one that may sound offensive, but keep in mind the historical context. Why in the world would people that are trying to invent a story that would gain traction and that could be used as a way to gain influence and gain converts around the world, why would the first witnesses of the resurrection be women? In a time and in a culture where women were literally not allowed to be witnesses in any kind of legal proceeding, why would you choose women to be the first witnesses of the resurrection of your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? Just doesn't make any sense. Makes absolutely no sense. That doesn't mean I think women can be witnesses in court. Things have changed an awful lot. I actually think this speaks to the more progressive take of the scriptures in a lot of ways that we don't give them a lot of credit for. A lot of the things that we've moved past precisely because the Bible helped us. The Christian church helped us get past a lot of these things. So, too counterproductive to be legends. Why would they write these kinds of things in there? There's a little bit more here on page 9. There's something about Peter's denial of Jesus. He calls down curses on his master. Why would anyone in the early church want to play up the terrible failures of their most prominent leaders? The Gnostic Gospels themselves, they actually fit in much better with the worldview of the Greco-Roman world at the time. They didn't believe in the material world as being a good thing. They thought the material world is a dark, evil place from which our spirits need to be rescued by some secret illumination or gnosis, secret knowledge. And that fits in well with where the Greeks and the Romans were at. But the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, not only give us a far more historically credible picture of what the original Jesus was like, but they boldly challenge the worldview of their Greek and Roman readers, right? So if they were trying to gain acceptance, they wouldn't have talked about the material world being a good thing, and that God was coming in to save it, breaking in to demonstrate his desire and his power to save, and doing all these healings and putting bodies and back together and bringing people back from the dead. You know, in the Gnostic view, you're dead, you're free, you're finally free of this mess, this physical world, this evil place, and Jesus is bringing people back into it. Because why? Well, because it's good. It's not what it was intended to be, but it's good. All right, and then this next section here, the literary form of the Gospels is too detailed to be legend. And so C.S. Lewis, you get a lot of C.S. Lewis quotes in this book. Phenomenal author, phenomenal apologist for the Christian faith. And he was a world-class literary critic. And when reading the Gospels, he noted, I have been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, and myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know none of them are like this. Of this gospel text, there are only two possible views. Either this is reportage, so reporting actual historical events, or else some unknown ancient writer, without known predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic, realistic narrative. So what he means here, ancient fiction was nothing like modern fiction. Modern fiction is realistic and contains all kinds of details, but ancient fiction, never. It's not until the last few hundred years where that even began to be a thing. In modern novels, details are added to create the aura of realism, but that was never the case in ancient fiction. And so now he's going to go into some details that jump off the page of Scripture when you understand the context in which they're written, the time and place. In Mark chapter 4, we're told Jesus was asleep on a cushion in the stern of a boat. That's a pretty impressive detail. In John 21, we're told that Peter was 100 yards out in the water when he saw Jesus on the beach. He then jumped out of the boat, and together they caught 153 fish. In John 8, as Jesus listened to the men who caught a woman in adultery, we're told he doodled with his finger in the dust. If you were making up a story about Jesus, we might include some of those details, but that just wasn't something that they did in the first century. There's also another section here on recollective memory, and he references Richard Bauckham again, the theologian, the author I mentioned earlier, that was quoted earlier. Recollective memory, so the kinds of memories, as you're trying to remember events, this is sort of a study on what that looks like, okay? So recollective memory is selective. It fixes on unique and consequential events. It retains irrelevant detail, as Lewis observes. It takes the limited vantage point of a participant rather than that of an omniscient narrator, and it shows signs of frequent rehearsal. Bauckham then shows these same marks in the gospel narratives. Vivid and important events can stay with you for decades if frequently rehearsed and or retold. Factor in the fact that disciples in the ancient world were expected to memorize Master's teachings, and that many of Jesus' statements are presented in a form that was actually designed for memorization, and you have every reason to trust the accounts. And then Bauckham cites Jan or Jan van Siena's study of oral traditions in primitive African cultures. in which fictional legends and historical accounts are clearly distinguished from each other, and much greater care is taken to preserve historical accounts accurately. This finding undermines 100 years of critical gospel scholarship. So basically what he's saying is that the critical idea is that, well, this is just how they do things. They didn't have a way to distinguish between historical and legend, and so they just kind of get blurred together, and the history becomes legend. Legend seems more like history, and it's just one big convoluted mess. These people were simple and primitive. They didn't know what they were doing. Apparently, that's not true. And this is a quote from, I think, Balcom, but quoting Van Sina. Gospel scholars from the form critics onward believed that early Christians in the transmission of Jesus' traditions would not have made any distinction between the past time of the history of Jesus and their own present, because oral societies do not make such distinctions. This is untrue. So, again, just tearing down the walls of all of these Bible scholars out there, supposed Bible scholars out there, that have been just taking apart the authority of the Bible, the validity, the trustworthiness of the message of the Bible. It's just, it doesn't hold water. It doesn't stand up to really critical thinking and study and investigation. All right. More about the Da Vinci Code. Yeah, speculative histories were out there before Dan Brown wrote, but they didn't make the bestseller lists, and their authors didn't go on the Daily Show. Yeah. So that's kind of what our battle is right now. There's just anybody that gets a platform can just put these ideas out there, and when you act like you know what you're talking about, you get enough of an audience, it sort of just becomes something that people believe to be true. That's kind of what we're dealing with. This is another, back to the idea of this is written too early. If the skeptics about the Bible are right, the disciples must have been translated into heaven immediately after the resurrection. That is the only way that the legendary elements could have come into the story of Jesus by the time the Gospels were written. And the actual foundations of all this scholarship that we've been talking about out there are eroding fast. So the critical scholars, there's just not a lot out there to support anything that they've been saying for a long time. Now we get into a section here on how the Bible, the issues of trusting the Bible culturally, and this is basically saying, like, okay, so what if the Bible is reliable? What if the Bible is true? It doesn't matter because the stuff in there is just awful. I hate it. I can't stand it. It's culturally regressive. And he talks about how it used to be in New York City. He would find people that just couldn't trust the Bible, but now there are people that just hate its message. So whether it's trustworthy or not doesn't matter. They don't like what it says. And this is really helpful. This is interesting. I think it's actually helpful for us, not just in conversations with people outside of Christianity, people exploring Christianity, people with objections to Christianity. I think this is actually helpful for Christians too. Some things for us to always keep in the forefront of our mind. So essentially, he tells this story about how there was a young artist who came up to him after a worship service, and he was almost apoplectic, he says, because he had just come across the passage in the Bible where it says, "Slaves, obey your masters." And then he talks about how he advised this gentleman and how he advises lots of people with these issues to approach them. He says, many people simply run viscerally from any consideration of the Bible once they find such a biblical passage. And he counsels them to slow down. Slow down, okay? And try out several different perspectives on the issues that trouble them. That way they can continue to read, learn, and profit from the Bible, even as they continue to wrestle with some of its concepts. So find out what some people might think about that passage and what it really means before you go nuts, before you throw the whole thing out. Okay? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. He says, one possibility I urge them to consider is that the passage that bothers them might not teach what it appears to them to be teaching. And then he talks a little bit about slaves, obey your masters. We talked a lot about slavery in a previous episode from a previous chapter. Slavery at the time was just not, it's just not the same thing that we get in our minds when we hear slavery. When we hear slavery, we think the slavery that existed here in the United States, and that we fought a war to put an end to, that was race-based, that involved kidnapping, which is totally banned in the Bible. You may not kidnap someone and force them into slavery. It's outlawed in the Old Testament. It's outlawed in Scripture. And so it was a slavery that was based off of, the owner owned all of you. It didn't. The owner didn't just own your production, your resources, your talent and work. They owned you, and they could do whatever they wanted with you. And that's not what Paul is talking about when he says, "Slaves, obey your masters." He's actually talking to a normal middle class of people that you could never tell who was a slave and who wasn't. They were just out there, and many people bought themselves out of slavery. They were manumitted at some point. So as you come across something in Scripture that just makes you want to blow up and explode and run from the whole thing, just consider for a moment that if you spend some time talking to some people that know a lot more, might you find that what you think it's saying is not what it's actually saying. Now, the other part, this is something, again, even for Christians, for us to keep in mind. So here he says, some texts may not teach what they at first appear to teach. Some people, however, have studied particular biblical texts carefully and come to understand what they teach, and yet they still find them outrageous and regressive. What should they do then? So, he goes on here to say that basically there may be some unexamined belief inside of you or me as we struggle with something like that in the superiority of our own historical moment over all others. So basically we say, at our moment in history, we've got all this right, and all these people before us were idiots. And it's just awful, and so therefore we got to throw this stuff out. But to reject the Bible as regressive is to assume that you have now arrived at the ultimate historic moment from which all that is regressive and progressive can be discerned. That belief is surely as narrow and exclusive as the views in the Bible you regard as offensive. And then he uses an example here. Talks about Anglo-Saxons, British people, how they differ from the views of their ancestors, the Anglo-Saxons 1,000 years ago. He talks about a passage from Mark chapter 14. They see that Jesus claims to be the Son of Man who's coming at the end of time to judge the whole world according to his righteousness. And later they read about Peter, the leading apostle, who denies his master and at the end even curses him to save his skin. And then Peter is forgiven and restored to leadership. Now, the first story will make contemporary British people shudder. They shudder at the whole idea of a judgment. Okay. However, they will love the story about how even Peter can be restored and forgiven. But the first story about judgment will not bother the Anglo-Saxons at all. They know all about doomsday, and they are glad to get more information about it. However, they are shocked at the second story. Disloyalty and betrayal at Peter's level must never be forgiven in their view. It's a tremendously shame and honor-based culture, the Anglo-Saxons. He doesn't deserve to live, let alone become the foremost disciple. They will be so appalled by this that they will want to throw the Bible down and read no more of it. So, how can we use our time standard of progressive as the plumb line by which we decide which parts of the Bible are valid and which are not? Many of the beliefs of our grandparents and great-grandparents now seem silly and even embarrassing to us. And that process is not going to stop now. Our grandchildren will find many of our views outmoded as well. Wouldn't it be tragic if we threw the Bible away over a belief that will soon look pretty weak or wrong? To stay away from Christianity because part of the Bible's teaching is offensive to you assumes that if there is a God, he wouldn't have any views that upset you. Does that belief make sense? Man, I just love the way Tim Keller just does a marvelous job of, he's really zinging us, all of us, right? But he just does it so eloquently, so intelligently. But that's what he's like, who the heck do we think we are to think that if there is a God, that he's not going to have different ideas about some things than we do, right? If God doesn't have ideas that are different from what we have, then how is he God? Or is that us thinking we're God, right? It's just unbelievable. I just love the way he does this. And one more bit of advice to people struggling with some of the Bible's teachings: we should make sure we distinguish between the major themes and the message of the Bible and its less primary teachings. He talked a little bit about this with the whole evolution idea, that there are Christians that are okay with evolution to a degree, to an extent, not that it's the answer to the origins of everything, that no, God still created, but he uses this process. There are a lot of Christians that agree on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and all the core teachings, but they may differ on some non-primary things. And so just hold off a little bit, stick to the big issues, and focus on those things, and then find out where maybe there's a wide variety of opinions on some things. We know very little for sure, in the Christian faith. There's a lot that we're pretty sure of, and some really key things that we hold to pretty strongly, but there's an awful lot that the Bible isn't crystal clear on, and we just kind of are dealing with the gray area, walking through the fog a little bit. I'm thinking of a quote. I don't know who said this. I think I heard it in seminary, maybe one of my professors, maybe he was quoting somebody else. But we know precious little about God, about everything that there is to know. We know precious little. But the little that we do know is precious. And so stick with that, and not trying to get all the answers, because that's just not going to happen. We're just not going to get all the answers. Certainly not all the answers we want. All right. A trustworthy Bible or a Stepford God. This just gets back to that idea. He talks about the movies, the Stepford Wives, the husbands of Stepford, Connecticut, decide to have their wives turned into robots who never cross their wills of the wills of their husbands. A Stepford wife was wonderfully compliant and beautiful, but no one would describe such a marriage as intimate or personal. So if you pick and choose, now what happens if you eliminate anything from the Bible that offends your sensibility and crosses your will? If you pick and choose what you want to believe and reject the rest, how will you ever have a God who can contradict you? You won't. You will have a Stepford God, a God essentially of your own making, and not a God with whom you can have a relationship and genuine interaction. Only if your God can say things that outrage you and make you struggle, as in a real friendship or marriage, will you know that you have gotten hold of a real God and not a figment of your imagination. So, an authoritative Bible is not the enemy of a personal relationship with God, it is the precondition for it. So, if God is a personal God and He wants us to be in relationship with Him, um, when you're in a relationship, people contradict you. People don't always agree with you. They're not robots. And certainly God is not a robot of our own making. And so sometimes we're going to find things in the Bible that are offensive to us. I think that's actually kind of the point. We are not who we should be. And that's why Jesus came into the world. One day we will be who we should be. And the earth and the universe will be as it should be, as God intended it to be. But we're not yet. And so He will contradict us. The Bible will contradict us. And that should be okay. Especially a text that is this historically substantiated, historically and culturally reliable, more so than any text that exists in the world today. So, pretty important. Bible's pretty important. Yeah, people are terrible. Churches can be terrible. Church people can be terrible. Christians, right? But that doesn't change the truth. In fact, I think the Bible helps us understand what's all wrong with all that stuff. So take a look at it again if you haven't already. Let me know if you got any questions. Put comments or whatever up on here, and maybe we'll get a chance to tackle them at some point. But I hope this was helpful for you. I hope that you're finding the Bible maybe isn't so horrible as you may have thought. If you've trusted the Bible before, maybe now you have a little bit more substantial support for your beliefs. And I hope you are able to read it and take what it says to heart more than ever before. Not because it's a great book, but because it points to a great God and His Son Jesus. And remember, ice cream is sweet, but Jesus is sweeter. Sweet Jesus, signing off. Have a great night.